Everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Global Running Academy show. I'm Eric Orton and got my co-host here, Zach Friedley, who just came back from Ecuador. What were you doing in Ecuador?
I was climbing Cayambe with a group called Romp and the legend Carl Egloff, which is always a pleasure to be around him and see that guy moving around the mountains.
Tell people more about Carl. I mean, I shouldn't say most, but maybe majority of ultra runners out there listening and watching know of Killian, but I put Carl right up there with Killian, but he's someone most of us have never heard of.
So Carl Egloff, you should look him up. He's a Swiss Ecuadorian. I believe his mother was Ecuadorian and his father was from Switzerland. And he is a mountain guide more around the world, but like he's pretty much climbing the volcanoes in Ecuador, Cayambe, Chimborazo, and Cotopaxi. He's got some FKTs around the world on some of the mountains you've heard of. Like he's had the Denali FKT. He's taken the FKT from Killian on a couple different mountains. He's basically just like Killian, except Carl focuses not on the racing aspect and like the training, like the UTMBs. He's more of just a guy that likes to go up mountains and take people with him. And he's been the guide on this romp trip for like 9 years. And what's really unique about the romp expedition is all of us on the trip have we're either missing our legs below the knee, above the knee, arms. There's some sort of disability, and Carl's been taking this group up mountains like Cotopaxi for 9 years. And this past weekend we did Cayambe, particularly because Cotopaxi is still erupting, so the park is closed. There's no ETA on when it's going to open. So we did Cayambe, and Cayambe was about 10 times harder than Cotopaxi was for me. I summited Cotopaxi last year, and Cayambe is just longer. It's about 5K longer round trip, so you're out there longer. There's a little bit more technicality to begin the climb, like rock scrambling, sand, which is like really hard to do at 16,000 feet. And then I got all the way up to about 18.8, and the peak is about 18.9. But yeah, it was just a learning experience for me. I learned more about myself in these situations. I learned what works, what doesn't work, which I think is always important on a big expedition like that. So the next time around, I can make some adjustments and have maybe some more success. Because I did make the decision to turn around about 80 meters to go. And that was just a personal decision. Before the expedition, I told myself that if I had to go into that like place to garner some energy, like I had to do a UTMB, that I just wasn't going to go there because I felt depleted emotionally. And I got to that spot and was like, all right, this is it, turn around. And I was really I felt confident making that decision and didn't have any like sadness or I messed up. It was just a decision that I made and turned around and came back. Because a lot of people don't realize this, I could have probably made it to the top, no problem, but then you got to come back, and that's where the injuries happen. That's where things can go south. So I have this like calculation I did in my brain. I just didn't feel confident that I could return without injuring myself, and I just wanted to be injury free from this.
Well, and that kind of strikes two things where when you're on top, you're halfway, right? And
Yeah,
and it goes into what we talked about prior to you leaving about how we need to deal with burnout after a big year. And I
yeah,
think that was a smart decision of really understanding and prioritizing why you were there and what's your bigger goals out there for next year. And I think that was a wise choice to keep it doable and keep it fun. And, all within that scope of more important things.
yeah. I felt really good about the decision. It's because it's really easy to get caught up in the summit fever and push yourself there, and then you get hurt on the way back. And I just was proud of myself for making that call in a moment like that.
So this is your second big peak, and having done ultras, for those ultra runners out there and runners in general, how is mountaineering similar to running, and how is mountaineering very different from running?
Yeah, so there's a lot of similarities. but there's a lot of differences, and I think they both complement each other. Because last year I climbed Cotopaxi. It's very intense. You're very high. There's a lot of exposure, and I managed to get over that fear and work through that fear. And then this year in the trail running world, when I was in Chamonix and I was on exposed cliffs and exposed trails, that experience of Cotopaxi came in, and I was like, oh, I can do this. I can navigate this. I'm okay. And then, this year on Kayambe, my heart rate remained low, even at altitude. We slept at the refuge is at 15,100 feet. My resting heart rate the first night there was 45, whereas like some of the people I was with was like in the 90s. And I didn't do any mountaineering specific training. I was just running in France all summer. So I think my heart rate really was complemented up there. It didn't stress my body out a lot. And I really like how on a mountain, when you're mountaineering, it's all about your rhythm. There is no urgency to move fast and get to the next checkpoint. I mean, there might be if the sun comes out and you're running slow and the glacier's melting, so then there might be some urgency. But typically, you get into this rhythm that you can like maintain like one foot in front of the other, and I like that aspect of it because it's a different change of pace than mountain running when I'm like trying to just jam it out to get to the next spot. So you can like look around, smell the roses a little bit more, take in the views. I just really enjoy that aspect, and it's one of the hardest things I've ever done too. It's not easy, and you get to see things that almost make your brain explode when you're up that high.
Yeah, and I found it's easier to be in the moment in mountaineering where there's that, since there's not that urgency like in racing.
Yeah,
You just, like you said, you smell the roses, but that kind of, I found it's a little easier to kind of get in the zone or in the flow. Whereas
yeah,
running, sometimes you have to really practice that feeling.
yep.
Yeah. So
And I can take my time and I can drink enough water. I can eat. It's just like you're kind of like on a vacation in the mountains, really. Even though it's super intense.
well, you mentioned heart rate, and I think that's a great segue into our main set of this episode. And for those of you who are maybe watching for the first time, this show, this Run Academy show, is really meant to be a mentorship type of show for Zach as a coach, but anybody out there who's wanting to learn more about training, racing, coaching, and that's really what we're bantering about. Coach, Zach is an aspiring coach, and we're just gonna bring up topics that Zach has questions about, and today we're gonna talk about heart rate.
Yeah, so with our training, I know we have 8 zones, and I've talked to some other people that seems like foreign to them. So maybe you can tell me why we train in 8 heart rate zones.
Yeah, I actually get, I wouldn't say a lot of questions, but after putting my book out, The Cool Impossible, where I have 8 training zones, I would often get questions of, hey, how do I put this into my Garmin that where they only allow for 5? Or, other heart rate watches where you can't put in 5. And um, I, I think that the simplest answer is that how I've configured the energy systems in the training zones are used in multiple ways for multiple athletes. For example, a marathoner is running flat roads. Their efforts much steadier, where 3-4 beats matter. And those 8 zones also refer to marathon or road types of environment energy systems that relate to their training or their race effort. So for example, if we're on the road, zone 4 heart rate is going to be about a marathon type of effort or a marathon training effort. And therefore I can use that. And it's really a very short 5 beat, 4 or 5 beat range that is appropriate for the roads because we want the effort to be as steady as possible. And really important in marathon training is to be able to run as steady as possible and as focused as possible. So using a 4 or 5 beat range helps train not only the physiological adaptations we want for that marathoner, but it also helps them to be very, very focused for a long time, which is what's
Yeah.
required in a marathon.
Yeah.
Now, if we flip that to on the trail, if we were looking for that same type of effort, I might merge 2 or 3 of the heart rate zones together. So it could be, hey, Zach, go out and run steady for 45 minutes in zone 3 through 5, because
Yeah.
now we have hills. We know that the effort's going to be fluctuating a little bit, and it's harder to keep that heart rate steady.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the primary reason why there's so many. It just allows me flexibility within any given workout for the purpose, also based on the athlete I'm dealing with. So it's actually more from my end than the
Yeah.
athlete. And so
Well,
it just gives me flexibility.
well, I think for me, I had no heart rate training prior to this working with you. And when we implemented, I got the heart rate strap and started like paying attention to my heart rate and running like that. I felt like my running, I understood my running more. I understood my body and my perceived efforts and all these things. And then the first race we had at New Zealand in Tarawera, you gave me like a roadmap of like, hey, run this section at this rate, run this section at this rate. If you get above this, wait till it comes down to this. So I had like a real specific plan, and I never once felt like I was going to blow up in that race because I was running certain like sections at that heart rate zone, and I had the consciousness of like, wow, if I didn't have that like number, I might be going outside of that number, and I might not, be able to finish this race like I could.
Well, and
So I
that
found it
also
helpful.
that goes back to the training too, because I'm having you do that in training, and you now know what 160 feels like. You know what
Yeah,
150 feels like, and it's creating this awareness and going back to the questions I get about why 8 training zones. Um, Most of the times I'm getting those questions because people can't program 8 training zones into their watch. It's not
yeah,
out of a physiological curiosity. It's, hey,
interesting.
I only have slots for 5. What do I do? And what
Yeah,
I tell them is, in 2 or 3 weeks, you should have your heart rate zones memorized, because you
yeah,
should
I
be
have
always
them.
looking and monitoring and engaging how you're feeling from a perceived exertion relative to your heart rate. And that's super great knowledge for racing and what you
Yeah,
understand as potential.
yep.
And
Um,
so that's what's so helpful once you get into the race, is that this is nothing that you haven't done in training, and you really know what 150 feels like, what 160 feels like. And if you're running for 10 hours, hey, 160 is going to be too hard, you got to back off.
I will say it's hard to know that when you're at altitude. So like there was moments when I was up on Cayambe at like 17,000 feet, and I thought I was like maybe like 80 or 90, and I looked down, I'm like 120, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of insane. And same thing with like when I was in the lodge walking around, didn't feel like anything. And I looked down, I'd be at like 95. So I actually didn't move very much up there because it was kind of stressing my body in a way that was unnecessary.
Well, and that's a great point. Altitude is very, very tricky. Is that what you just described on a low level effort, walking around or
Yeah,
hiking easy, elevates the heart rate at altitude higher than normal. But once you get up to a higher effort, it drops because you're not able to work as hard. So
interesting.
two things go on, and it's almost kind of opposite of what's happening.
I didn't get my heart rate above like 144 while I was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I was also very conscious of breathing into my nose deeply, exhaling through my mouth. I even told one of my teammates that was with me. He was like, "Hey, I see you like checking your watch, and what do you have going on?" And I told him what I was doing, and he's like, "Can you give me any tips?" And I'm like, "Yeah, stay under 140. Try to make that your goal." And he did. And he was like, "Dude, that was the best advice that I had ever received."
Yeah. And see, and again, that's where it becomes such a crucial tool to start to understand what's really going on with your body, even from a fueling standpoint. If you're in a long race or climbing a mountain and you've kind of held steady at 140, 142 for a couple hours, and all of a sudden now it's 120, what's that telling you? That's telling you, hey, yeah, you're starting to fatigue, but more importantly, you're starting to become low on fuel.
Interesting. I did not know that.
So that's a great troubleshooting tactic for in long runs. Hey, all of a
Yeah.
sudden, hey, it's hour 4 now and your heart rate's dropped to, maybe 10 beats or so. Sure sign that you're low on energy, and eating will bring that back up. Same in the
Interesting.
race. Yeah.
I did notice a lot of the people I was climbing with, even the ones that were experienced, they don't eat like they should. I feel like that's like a missed opportunity in the mountaineering world, because there's a lot of opportunities to eat along the way, and that might make the experience more pleasurable, or maybe you could be a little bit stronger up there.
Well, and I think that's where, coming from a running background where we know how important that is, and that becomes a big part of what we do within our long runs and our training and racing, that we sometimes see it as second nature because we know
Yeah,
how important it is, where these people going into mountaineering maybe don't have that background and don't really understand how important it is to eat.
yeah, it helped me a lot. I brought more than most people up there. I had liquid calories, I had bar calories, I had goos. I even had some calories with caffeine in it and plugged those in at the right moments. I felt like my nutrition knowledge from trail running really elevated me on that mountain.
Well, and it's a slower burn too. So if you're gonna bonk mountaineering, it's gonna happen much slower. It's not as
Yeah,
apparent as if you're out running, which can almost get you in more trouble because you don't realize it's happening, and all of a sudden, an hour later, you can't move, and you got the altitude working against you. And at altitude, it's even harder to eat,
yeah.
especially any solid foods.
I
So
felt hungry
yeah,
up
no,
there a
that's
lot.
it's all that's really, really tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky. And then how much water do you bring? And then you're like how much do you want your pack to weigh? There's a lot of stuff that kind of goes into it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And all that again will affect your heart rate and your effort.
Yeah, I think my pack choice next time is going to be 40 liters. Depending on how long, like this time I was out for 12 to 14 hours and I brought about 3 liters of water. Like I had fresh water in my bladder. I had two 500 milliliters filled with tailwind and then two 500 milliliters filled with just fresh water. And I was just rotating those all around.
Right, right,
And you got to be
right.
careful because then at a certain altitude they freeze. Oh, it's a game.
Yeah. Um, Back to heart rate. So when we first started working together, and a lot of times when athletes are starting to use heart rate for the first time, there's a certain amount of patience required for running at the lower end of the heart rate. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I had to slow down a lot, honestly. And I had to just kind of be okay with running slower than I would normally run. But I just felt my knowledge and understanding of my body became almost like second nature. Whereas before I was running off perceived effort, and sometimes perceived effort isn't real like science, you know? So it was cool for me to switch over because I feel like I might be a numbers person and I like to see the visual of where I'm at, and having those heart rate zones after each workout really helped me kind of understand me as an athlete.
Well, and keep in mind, there's two things going on, or two purposes of the heart rate training and the training zones. Getting back to 8 versus 5, we talked about how the reason I have 8 relate to different types of race intensity training zones, but there's also the physiological part of the training zones. Zone 6 is threshold. Zone 2 and zone 3 is that, your aerobic base zone. In between is more of a strength endurance. So understanding the energy system or the physiological traits of these zones is super, super important.
Yeah.
not only in training, but again, relative to the distance of the race.
Yeah, and those zones can change too through a training block, can't they?
Yeah, so that's the key is that, and that's why I use a 1 mile test to formulate the heart rate training zones, because that mimics a VO2 max style of effort, where now we can do a simple field test out on the track and not have to go into the lab, where the lab can be, plus or minus 10% error. Where
Yeah.
now a true field test is really true and feels real to the athlete. So we're using this 1 mile test to formulate the 8 training zones, but it's not so taxing that we cannot do it frequently. So we can do it,
Yeah.
every 8 weeks or so, and to see your speed development within the heart rate and where your heart rate is developing.
Cool. Yeah. I think it's helped me as an athlete. Plus not everybody has access to a lab. I'd say 1% of the people that we know probably have that.
Well, and I would argue that, again, because there is a plus or minus of percentage of error, that's not necessarily the best case scenario. Is that one,
Yeah.
if you've ever gone into a lab and done a VO2 max effort, not
Yeah.
only do you have something around your face
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is not natural, you having to try to breathe through a tube, that's not natural. And it's a progression of effort, which is not natural. So
Yep.
to go out and run around a track for 4 laps at a steady effort, kind of almost as hard as you can, that's as simple of a field test and most appropriate to what we're used to doing as you can get. And again, I would argue that the results are the same.
Yeah. I think I'll be ready for my next training block here in the next week or two.
Good, good.
And I'm excited to see where we're at with the heart rate zones and stuff.
Yeah, and so when we start up again, we'll always, part of the startup again is maybe we'll take a week or so to get you back into the groove, get you consistent with running again, make sure you're recovered from the mountaineering adventure last week, and then when we feel like you're consistent and feel confident in doing that test, we'll retest. We'll compare it to all the tests we've had done in the past, and that's just a benchmark for where we start. We're not
Yeah.
looking for a PR, and I tell my athletes, this is just a benchmark for where you're at right now. It's your fingerprint, it's your current fingerprint. Okay.
Yeah.
And that, not unlike our fingerprint, that fingerprint, your heart rate fingerprint, changes through time, and we want it to change.
Totally.
So that's just as our benchmark to get going. And, and you also have to take into consideration the time of year too, is that a
Yeah.
lot of times, unlike you, California, who have, somewhat same weather year round, if I'm starting a new athlete up in December and they're back east or somewhere cool, I have to take into account when they're testing. And if they're testing in December, hey, those numbers are going to look different than in April, because
Yeah.
now it's warmer. The warmer weather is going to elevate their heart rate a little bit. So I'll retest based on weather conditions as well.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. And again, using me as an example, just as a, kind of simple example, once I hit winter, I'm looking at, sometimes a low of minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, when I'm running. And now we're talking about maybe a 10 beat difference across the board, because it's so cold, it's hard for me to work hard. If my zone 2, zone 3 is 145, it's really about 135 in the heart of the winter.
Wow.
Yeah.
Never ran that cold, so I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you've got to take into consideration the extremes. If it's super cold, your heart rate's going to be low. If it's super high, your heart rate's just going to be a little bit higher.
Yeah. So when I started working with you, first thing you told me to do was to get a heart rate strap, which I didn't have. And I assume the reason why we do that is because the wrist heart rate isn't as accurate as the heart one that's strapped to your chest.
Yeah, spot on. I found that, relying on the wrist monitoring, you can kind of see the optical
Yep.
technology there. It just reads through your wrist. It's just not very accurate. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it fluctuates while you're out running. And it just is just not very accurate. And I found sometimes it's just useless. For me,
Interesting.
I have kind of a really bony, skinny wrist, and I've got to really, really tighten it down and almost not even move my wrist for it to work even somewhat well. Um,
Interesting.
so that's why I use the chest strap. And that, once you get used to the chest strap, it's completely accurate, and completely black and white as far as accuracy. So if you're really concerned about getting accurate numbers, go to the chest strap. And I know nowadays they have some manufacturers
Does
have a
that one.
little band that goes around your bicep and tricep, and I used those maybe 10 years ago, and I don't think technology was advanced enough for them to work very well, but I've just noticed recently some runners using them, so I might need to try those to see how accurate those are again. But if you're really concerned, use a chest strap.
Yeah, I think the person I saw was Hayden Hawks, sponsored by Coros, and I think they just have a new piece of equipment that comes out that's the heart rate strap on your shoulder. But I like the one on my chest. I have sometimes forget that I'm even wearing it. Even after a workout, I'll come home and I'll be like, "Oh yeah, I saw my chest strap on." But I've been using it for a year, and it's one of those things that I take with me everywhere I go because
Yeah,
it's like just like your shoes.
yeah. And again, once you start to understand what those numbers mean and just get a correlation day to day, it's just something that you have with you to understand what your body's going through. You can use heart rate to detect, your fatigue levels. You know,
Yeah, I use that a lot.
you know,
Um,
you'll notice, if you're coming off a hard weekend, back to back runs, and Monday's your recovery or off day, and you go out for your recovery run, and you're I'm having you run in zone one anyways. But it's sometimes when you're really fatigued, you could try to run really, really hard and your heart rate not elevate. And that's a sure sign that in this situation, your legs are tired, and therefore they're so tired you can't work them very hard, and that it won't allow the effort or the elevation of the heart rate to happen. Whereas in racing, it's more of a fueling aspect. So again, it's a
Interesting.
good way to detect just how you're feeling or how your legs will help you perform. And
And I
and
can
that
detect
again
too
too,
if I'm sick.
even in a another run that maybe you're fatigued in general, and you have intervals that day, and your heart rate's just not elevated, and your legs aren't feeling good. That's a sure sign that you're just not recovered, and maybe just make it a recovery run that day and skip that workout or move it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think not to switch total gears, but I think one thing we need to mention is that there's so much noise out there on how important zone two is. And
Yeah.
rightfully so. It's super important. But with anything these days, with so much content out there, it just, I think, gets overrated because it's such a talking point, and there's so many other benefits to other types of running than just zone two while you're in your base building zone, while you're in your base building phase. I have you do short, fast runs.
Yep.
So I think it's important to know that zone two is really, really important, but you're missing out on other types of strength that can happen during base building if that's all you're doing is zone two.
What made Zone 2 so popular all of a sudden? Was it just because Killian wrote a book and like people know that Kipchoge runs like 80% of his workouts in Zone 2?
It no, I my feeling is it's just a lot of content providers needing a talking point, and that's something that it's just a trendy thing to talk about. And again, I'm not saying that to minimize the importance of it, but when it becomes such an easy talking point for anybody to spit out content, it gets overblown. And why I'm bringing this up is that we tend to think that's all we should be doing, and there's
Yeah.
some people that says that's all we should be doing.
I
But
didn't know
I'm
that.
telling you, you're missing out if you're not doing neuromuscular sprints. You're not doing short hill repeats during your base building phase. And it has nothing, if you're introducing some of that neuromuscular training, it's not going to in any way inhibit what you're trying to accomplish with your zone 2 training. And with that, we talked about the inaccuracy of the wrist monitoring. So too is the formulas, of calculating your heart rate training zones through a formula versus the field test that we spoke of earlier.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm learning a lot.
Yeah. So,
Heart rate zones are not straightforward.
it's super simple, actually, if you understand how to generate that data to develop your heart rate training zones.
Yeah.
And it's again, I think a lot of people are probably creating the same type of zones in different ways that are achieving the same thing. But the key is to understand that, for example, my training zone 6 is threshold where someone else is zone 4. So
Right.
we're doing the same thing. It's just we're calling it something different. And it's just
There's not a one size
understanding.
fits all. It's very
Yeah.
tailored.
Yeah. And it comes into how you're applying that within workouts, and then how that season progression and seasonal plan factors into how you're using your training zones.
Interesting.
So get away from using the formulas, because again, those are inaccurate too. And I've had an athlete for a long time who had a very, very, very low heart rate across the board. And if she used a formula, her threshold would be 15 beats higher than I had her threshold.
Oh man.
Can you imagine the overtraining that would have happened if she was just using a formula? The 180 minus your age or whatever other formulas are out there. They maybe they work for a certain group of people, but there's always those outliers that, hey, it's just not going to work for. And so,
Get hurt, I guess, couldn't you?
well, and it's harder also to measure progress. If you're always using a formula, you're using the same formula. You know, you're aging up once every year, but that's really not affecting much versus, hey, putting in a solid training plan and retesting and understanding how to improve ability is the key.
Cool. That's
Yeah.
super helpful.
Yeah. So, cool. Well, that's heart rate. We like I said, we could riff on that for days, and we will. But I think that's
We'll
a
bring it back.
good stopping point, and let people chew on that for a while. And again, I know everybody has lots of heart rate questions, so throw them down there. And again, we're looking at your questions to help formulate other episodes that we can help everybody out there. And that's really the purpose of this is to mentor Zach through his coaching journey, but also anybody out there who wants to learn more about the nitty gritty training, coaching, racing, training, running, whatever it is. So
We can get
awesome.
nerdy with running.
Exactly. So, all right, you got the last word. Send us off.
Just put one foot in front of the other and see where you can go. You can go anywhere you want.
Awesome. All right, man. Good stuff. All right, we'll see everybody next time. See ya.
Go Chiefs.